for as long as it takes.
As long as it takes!
But to do what? Despite over 2 years of war and hundreds of thousands of casualties, Western leaders remain divided on what they want Kyiv to achieve. Many only seek Ukraine's survival in some form as a sovereign nation. Others argue anything less than Russia's defeat, evicted from Ukraine entirely, would be appeasement and far more dangerous. This absence of a clear objective has led to a muddled policy of arming Ukraine with enough to survive, but not enough to win. As things stand, therefore, a prolonged bloody stalemate, or the slow attritional defeat of Ukraine, seems the conflict's most likely outcome. But let's imagine we did want Ukraine to win, and win decisively. What would it need? In this episode of Defence in Depth, I'll offer 5 things, 5 M's, that could transform Kyiv's fortunes on the battlefield. So let's start with the first. Number 1, munitions. Early uncertainty over the likelihood of Ukraine's survival and an enduring fear of Moscow using nuclear weapons has led to the West drip-feeding resources to Kyiv. Germany initially only offered 5,000 helmets. Tanks were held back. Yet now, 2 years in, we think little of advanced missiles or Challenger and Leopard tanks being donated to President Zelensky's generals. The major problem with this gradual increase is that it was in parallel, indeed in response to, Moscow's own mobilisations and weapons expansion. Thus, for Ukraine to win, increasing firepower and technological ability would need to be proactively expedited to give Kyiv a decisive advantage. The number 1 priority would be long-range air defences for shooting down missiles targeting core infrastructure. HIMARS and ATACMS too, for offensive operations, would also be paramount, as would tactical kamikaze drones. F-16 fighter jets are also a common request. But perhaps more important than the particulars is the ability to procure and replenish such weapons at speed. Current Western production levels, even for basics such as artillery shells, are insufficient, leading to heavy casualties for Ukraine and an inability to strategize beyond the short term, forcing them to ration material. So far, Western procurement strategies have focused on maximizing existing capacity. US Patriot missiles, GMLRs and ATACMS are made in the same single factory and are competing for the same resources. New factories would need to be set up to rapidly increase production for the long term. And this is even the best case scenario of the US remaining a key donor, by no means certain were Trump to return to the White House. Even if the Democrats win, it feels unlikely they will go much further in their support for Kyiv. In the end, therefore, with or without the US, this will be Europe's fight, and it will rest on the continent's shoulders to define what it wants the endgame to be, and what it is willing to offer Kyiv to enable that. Number 2, mandate. If you give someone a mandate, it gives them authority to act in a certain way. Just as important as having weapons is having the permission to use them effectively. For too long, Ukraine has had to fight the invading Russians with one hand tied behind its back. While Putin's forces could strike Ukraine from anywhere, Kyiv was restricted from striking targets in Russia with Western weapons, including on the very sites where many of the deadliest strikes and assaults were launched from. The most egregious example of this was with Russia's recent Kharkiv offensive, while Moscow's forces across the border were able to prepare for the assault on Ukraine's second city, largely unmolested. That battle ultimately showed the folly of the West's approach, with permissions eventually being granted from various Western countries, most crucially the US, enabling Ukraine to strike targets across the border. Yet for Kyiv, permissions should go much further, allowing them to strike deeper into Russian territory to hit more oil depots, airfields and other vital military sites. Resisted so far by Western powers because of the perceived risk Putin might use it as an excuse to escalate the conflict. As such, a broader mandate the West might want to consider granting Kyiv is to allow it to fight this conventional war without the fear of escalation being a consistent impediment for action. One of the reasons for Western uncertainty about its objective in Ukraine is that some nations don't believe Russia can ever be defeated because it has nuclear weapons. But this forgets that many atomic powers lose wars without resorting to their use, including the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Today, it's hard to see how China would ever back Moscow if it resorted to such a desperate gambit. And besides, where would Russia strike, and to what strategic end? It would be illogical, and would certainly end with its defeat, given the response it would trigger. The fear of having this conversation has only increased fear of the thing itself, to Moscow's advantage. Number 3, men. Future historians will ponder whether a few thousand Western troops being stationed in Kyiv at Zelensky's request would have been enough to deter invasion. Perhaps. But in our reality, some leaders, including President Macron, have called for clearly communicating to Putin that the West does have territorial red lines in Ukraine, so that, say, if Russian forces made significant advances, Putin would know Western countries would move in to parts of Ukraine where those troops have not yet reached, acting as a deterrent. That would be one way of seizing back the strategic initiative which has so often been ceded to Moscow. It is being discussed in Poland, Estonia and other states on Europe's eastern flank, but it's hard to see it being adopted unless the fall of Ukraine looks like a real prospect. Another option posited by some is that if any Western forces were to be deployed, they should be in non-combat roles away from the battlefield in order to free up Ukrainian soldiers for the front. It is debatable whether either of these ideas are essential for victory, but I would suggest how the West trains the Ukrainian military, something that Britain and other countries have been doing extensively, both before and since the full-scale invasion, absolutely is. Whilst largely praised, the failure of Ukraine's counteroffensive last year was partially blamed on inadequate, outdated advice. As such, Kyiv needs an improved, upscaled training programme from its Western allies if it is to learn the lessons and make major progress in 2025. Number 4, morale. Any of these suggestions and subsequent likely outcomes, such as a military success, would give a huge lift to the Ukrainians, just as the $60 billion aid package did when it was unblocked in Congress. Another way would be for the West to give a clearer idea of what military, financial and political reforms need to occur in Ukraine for it to meet NATO membership requirements. For many, the only way this war can end with a lasting peace is if there is no chance of a future Russian invasion, the key being that an effective military deterrent is in place. Yet despite NATO pledging that it considers Ukraine a future member, it is not united as to how it gets there. As such, Kyiv finds itself in a catch-22. Many would argue it cannot join NATO without the war ending, but that the war cannot end without it joining NATO, or at least without adequate security guarantees. Solving this problem will give an enormous boost to the morale of the Ukrainians. Number 5, money. To carry on war, 3 things are necessary. Money, money, and yet more money. A military maxim that remains as true today as it has throughout history. Whilst not as discussed, the West's propping up of Ukraine's economy has been a prerequisite of Kyiv's ability to wage war. But to win, it will need more. Not ad hoc, but locked in. It requires something akin to a long-term, perhaps a minimum of 5 years, financial commitment of $40 billion a year. It also needs infrastructure support, ensuring money gets to where it needs to be. The bottom-up nature of Ukrainian society was an asset early on, but it's clear to many that a greater top-down approach is now required, ensuring that money and material reaches the places where it's needed most, not just where those on the ground are the most effective at persuasion and organisation. Lastly, a much stronger sanctions regime would go a long way. Russia continues to get billions of dollars from Western countries for its oil and gas. And even more worryingly, weapons components, especially for drones, whilst banned from being sold directly to Russia, can be sold en masse to other countries who then sell them on to the Kremlin and other buyers. Closing these loopholes would be a huge step forward. So there we have it, 5 things, 5 M's that would make a marked difference on the trajectory of the war. To be clear, not all of these are prerequisites for victory, but just some of them might help tip the scales in Kyiv's favour. Have I missed something out? Do let me know in the comments. And if you're not already a listener, do check out our podcast, Ukraine The Latest, where we discuss such topics every weekday. Defence in Depth is a regular video output by The Telegraph of the big defence stories. Please do visit our website for the latest updates, news and analysis. Or failing that, you can always buy the paper.